going to unmute the room now.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to call the order of the Tuesday, March 15th Planning Commission meeting. Can I have a confirmation that the Kansas Open Meeting Act required notice have been properly distributed?
I can confirm that the packet was posted and the required notice of the meeting was provided.
Okay, thank you. Can I get a roll call, please?
I'm going to call roll here. Commissioner Gilmore. Commissioner Mikesell.
Here.
Commissioner Olson.
Here.
Commissioner Farber.
Here.
Commissioner Waters. Commissioner Bernhardt. Commissioner Jones.
Here.
Chair Hay.
Here.
That provides us with a quorum of 5 members for this appointed body, and so with confirmation that we've met our Open Meetings Act notice requirement and we have a quorum to proceed, we can now move ahead with today's agenda.
Okay, thank you. Get approval of the minutes of the March 1st, 2022 regular meeting.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion that we approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
We have a first and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. That passes 5-0. Okay, we'll move into new business, public hearings.
We have a continuation of an item from the March 1st meeting and then some other public hearing items after that. But the first item 3.1 is application P22-1 that's been filed by Building Kansas LLC requesting approval of a preliminary plat of a proposed 169 lot subdivision of a 53-acre tract located at the north end of Foxborough Drive and east of Centennial Road, and that is to be platted and known as the Aero Plains Addition. This is carried over from your March 1st meeting, and I thought just because it's a rather large packet, I would just, for the commissioners' benefit, that the first item is in your packet associated with this is the application that was filed. The second item is a legal description of the property and the ordinance that annexed that property into the city limits earlier this year in February. There is attached to that description just a boundary survey of the property that just shows the boundaries without any of the internal features or lots or streets. Then we have a letter from the Salina Airport Authority indicating that they are supportive of the project and they are agreeable to provide dedicated right-of-way for that 210-foot strip that extends out to the west here and connects this property out to Centennial Road. The next item in your packet is a summary of the factors that the Planning Commission is supposed to consider when they review a proposed preliminary plat, and then we have the staff report with a number of attachments and exhibits, and included with that is a copy of a traffic study that was prepared, a cross-section of the proposed levee crossing from Foxborough Drive, a sanitary sewer profile, and the force main location on a map, copy of the drainage study for the subdivision, and then a summary of the restrictions related to the gas pipeline that runs through this property. So this application was filed on behalf of Building Kansas LLC. It's for a tract of land that's bordered by unplatted agricultural land, which is outside the city limits on the north and on the east. There's property that's part of Schilling Subdivision Number 5 on the west, and what's known as the College Park Plan Development District, previously known as Schilling Manor Housing to the south. We have West Dry Creek that forms the property boundary on the east. There's a flood control levee that's a city levee, not a core levee, on the south property boundary, and there's an abandoned rail right-of-way and a unnamed drainage channel that runs along the west. So for everybody's bearings, this property is 1,600 feet north of Schilling Road, and it's 220 feet east of Centennial. On February 14th, the City Commission approved an ordinance annexing this property, and this has been brought forward to you as a preliminary plat to show how the property would be laid out and developed as a residential subdivision. If we look at previous action taken by this commission on February 15th, the commission approved a motion to recommend approval of the applicant's request to rezone this property to R2 for single-family attached dwellings and townhomes. At that same meeting, the Planning Commission recommended that consideration of the preliminary plat be postponed to the next available meeting. At that March 1st meeting, you voted to again postpone consideration of the plat to today's meeting. On page 2, we just summarized a list of items that staff had identified at the March 1st meeting and how those have since been addressed. So one of the questions asked was whether a traffic study had been done for this subdivision. We indicated that it had been, but that staff had some comments and revisions on it, and it was not, had not been sufficiently revised and updated to include in the Planning Commission packet. It is now, a revised impact study has been submitted, and it's been reviewed by the city engineer, and they provided a memo about that. We were recommending a modified street plan that addressed the need for future external connectivity, and so now on the plat, there are 3 different locations: northwest corner, middle north, and northeast corner, where there's possibilities for future street extensions to connecting development or subdivisions. So we asked for and got a revision to the drainage study and drainage plan. An updated drainage study has been submitted, and the applicant's drainage plan has been reviewed and approved by the city engineer. There's a memo from the city engineer in your packet with the drainage study. We wanted to make sure that plans for the extension of public utilities had been reviewed and approved by the Director of Utilities. The concern in that regard is that the sewer service for the entire subdivision is in the far southeast corner of the property, where Mr. Hers is showing his cursor there. And so we wanted to confirm that the property could be served by gravity sewer service without the need for a pump station, and that has been confirmed. We wanted to make sure that the Evergy transmission line that crosses the property from south to north and the sewer interceptor easements were clearly identified, and we wanted the location and dimensions of the high-pressure gas line finalized. And so on the plat that is in your packet today, that gas line easement is 50 feet in width, and it's located between Tim Rogers Lane and Amelia Lane, running from south to north across the property. And there's a 50-foot easement for that pipeline in the Wheat Ridge Addition to the south. And then we received a revised drawing that had all of the labeling, lot and block numbering, and all the items that we had requested. Additionally, at the March 1st meeting, there was a question raised regarding the actual height of the levee and the ability of a fire truck to drive over the levee. So the applicant has supplied a surveyed cross-section of the levee and a crossing design to show that the levee and the proposed access road will adequately handle fire truck usage in the case of an emergency. And so that has been included in your packet. So the subdivision regulations, as they were amended in 2016, require that all new subdivisions have at least one public street access point onto what's referred to as a direct access perimeter street. And in this case, Centennial Road is that direct access perimeter street. There'll be a direct street connection from this subdivision to Centennial Road. And then it advises that the new subdivision shall have any additional means of access in and out, either by direct street connection or indirectly to streets and adjoining subdivisions, as are necessary by the Planning Commission in order to assure safe and convenient movement of traffic within the subdivision and between adjoining subdivisions, safe and convenient movement of traffic to and from the subdivision, and access to and within the subdivision for fire and other public safety vehicles. So one of the challenges that we started out with here is this property is essentially landlocked with no frontage on or access to a perimeter street. It's historically been cultivated farm ground, and so to address this, Storage Mart obtained the right of access across property owned by the Salina Airport Authority so that they can directly access Centennial Road. To supplement that and to provide a second means of emergency access as required by the fire code, they're proposing to construct an emergency access road from the north end of Foxborough Drive across the levee and into the subdivision. In addition, as you can see on the north, there will be platted street connections that would allow for future street connections to be made either to an extension of Virginia Drive to the east or across the property to the north to Magnolia. There's a further option, and I think you have that map, Dustin, that also shows a potential to connect back to Centennial Road from the northwest corner. So the other thing we wanted to point out in terms of some of the design challenges that the applicants and their design team have had to work around, you start with the fact that you have a property that's bordered by stream channels and a levee. You have an abandoned rail right-of-way that occupies the west 100 feet, and because that was a rail right-of-way, you have an Evergy transmission line and a sewer interceptor line, and then you have a gas pipeline easement that crosses the property from south to north. And as we pointed out, this is located in the rear of the lots between Amelia Lane and Tim Rogers Lane. So as far as the street access and the particular design, Centennial Road is a arterial street. As constructed, it does meet city street standards for width, pavement design, curb and gutter. It currently carries, the most recent count from 2020 is 4,380 vehicles a day between Schilling and Magnolia. There's 3 possible future street connections. One would be tying Tim Rogers Lane back to Centennial Road. A second would be Fawcett Lane in a future street connection to Magnolia, and then Yeager Lane north and possibly east over to Virginia Drive. So we have a plat design that allows for these extensions, but the timing of when those adjoining properties will develop is not within anyone's control. So as a result of that, no development in Phase 2 can occur until that additional public street connection is made. And so staff has recommended that that be made a condition of any preliminary plat approval. In addition to that, the city engineer is looking into whether the city-owned levee that's north of Foxborough can be either lowered or eliminated at that location to possibly convert that connection from an interim access road to a public street extension instead. We want to make sure that that does not result in any changes to flood protection or change anybody's flood map status. So before that can be decided, there's going to be additional floodplain research and consultation with the flood map preparers to confirm that. But even if that was done, you would not have the remoteness standard from the fire code met. And so in order to be considered remote, the second means of access has to be at least half the diagonal distance of the subdivision away from the primary access point. And this subdivision would have a 2,600-foot diagonal distance, so the second access would need to be at least 1,300 feet away from Centennial Road, and Foxborough is 610 feet away. So Foxborough Drive works as an interim emergency access for Phase 1, but it does not work for full build-out of the subdivision. So the other thing that we wanted to point out is that we have looked at that, and the fire department's looked at it from various angles, and the internal connectivity within this subdivision is good, and so there's more than one route that can be taken to reach each lot, and there's no dead-end streets being proposed. So internal circulation is good. The internal streets would have 33 feet of paving and 60 feet of right-of-way. All of these would be public streets. We've highlighted the proposed street names on page 6 of your report. The original concept was to have Rogers Lane and Holly Lane, and first names were added to those to avoid conflicting with existing Rogers Court and Holly Lane, that even though it's spelled differently, if it was called in on 911, it would sound the same. So that has been changed to Steve Holly Lane. And then as we've reviewed this, it may end up that Armstrong Lane would need to be changed to avoid 911 conflicts because there's already an Armstrong Road in the county. So we've looked at the layout. There's 169 lots that are divided amongst 11 individual blocks. There's a drainage easement detention area set up in the southeast corner to handle stormwater runoff, and there's 2 areas set aside as common open space. So you have an open space over here, and then the applicant can confirm that, but we believe that the open space common area as you enter here would be an area for community mailboxes. Planning commissioners may or may not be aware that the U.S. Post Office has made a change to how they do mail delivery, and they no longer let individual dwellings put mailboxes out at the street. They require in new subdivision developments that there be a compound with community mailboxes. There's, depending on the space, you can have 3 or 4 community mailboxes within a subdivision, or you can have a community box for the entire development. The applicants will have to work that out with the post office, but conceptually, this area might be a suitable area for people coming into the subdivision to stop and pick up mail. So they can confirm how they plan to use that. One thing we just wanted to point out is over here on these townhomes, they would have a higher than minimum setback because we have the Evergy easement that goes through there, and they would need to keep the building setback of the townhomes outside of that easement. So in terms of utilities for this proposed subdivision, the water situation is quite good. As part of the Menards project, the city installed a 12-inch water main that runs down the west side of Virginia Drive, and then it extends along the north boundary of this subdivision. So that's a 12-inch line and provides good volume and fire flows. And then to supplement that, the applicant's design engineer is proposing to connect to the line that exists in Foxborough Drive. That's a 6-inch line, but it would provide 2 sources of flow in the case of an emergency. One thing we wanted to point out is that there was a benefit fee that was assessed to this property, the calculated benefit for the water line improvement, which is $115,371. There were also sewer lines that were installed as part of that Menards project, but none of those sewer lines that were installed directly benefited this property, so this property doesn't have a benefit fee for sewer. But there is a 16-inch sanitary sewer force main that runs through this property, but that cannot be tied into by gravity lines. So the solution the Director of Utilities has come up with is to send the sewer discharge from this to the manhole that Mr. Hers has identified there. And because these will all be slab-on-grade units, the entire subdivision can drain to that manhole and be served by gravity sewer. So it wouldn't be need for any force mains for this property. The plan is to construct a detention pond in the southeast corner. That would be in the range of 9 feet deep with freeboard, and the plan is that there would be a pump installed, and that would be detained and then pumped into Dry Creek at a controlled rate. Development of this property would be served by the Salina Fire Department because it is inside the city limits. The emergency response would be from station number 3 on Belmont, and this property is contiguous to areas that are within the city limits and already are receiving city police and fire protection. As far as the school boundaries, this is in the Schilling Elementary, South Middle, and South High School enrollment areas. We've been in dialogue with USD 305. They've indicated this is not going to be an area where there's any busing involved, so their identified safe route to school would be for children from this subdivision to go down Foxborough Drive, and then there's a already built sidewalk on the north side of Schilling Road that goes over and connects to a crossing there at Georgia, and then there's a signalized crossing at Royal Drive and Schilling Road. So that would be the route both for getting to school, and then there's a small city-owned operated pocket park there north of Schilling Elementary that would serve as a play area or playground for this area. There is not that's really kind of a pocket park and not a full neighborhood park, and so there's no neighborhood park directly in this area, but the development in this property would be subject to a park service fee that would be collected at the building permits, and those funds would go to either towards acquiring park land or for enhancing existing park facilities. This is in the Evergy service territory. Evergy plans to bring electricity from the west and the south to serve this subdivision. Just like our water department, Evergy likes to loop their lines and have 2 sources of electricity, so they would bring electricity in from Centennial and they would bring it in from the south from Foxborough. All electric lines in this subdivision would have to be placed underground. The original proposal from Evergy was that they wanted to put their lines out front, and then we discussed that with the developer. They went back and spoke with Evergy, and we believe that Evergy has now changed their minds and are now planning to serve individual lots from the rear easements, which makes a lot of sense in this layout like this. It's a lot more efficient to serve. You can serve 2 sets of lots from a single line by running it up the common rear lot line. So that is the plan for now, and then there's natural gas facilities available. So there was a traffic study done. It's in your packets. Centennial Road was improved as part of a KDOT project in 1995. Traffic study indicated that if you had 338 townhome units fully built out, that would add 2,448 vehicle trips to the existing daily traffic counts on Centennial, or about a 55% increase for that stretch of roadway. The conclusion was the current 2-lane roadway has the capacity to handle that additional traffic, with the exception of a recommendation that the only geometric improvement being a left turn lane for southbound traffic on Centennial. The other thing I would note is that we've had discussions with the applicants and their design team, and there is sufficient right-of-way, and at this point, they plan to construct a 3-lane intersection at Centennial so that they would have a right turn lane, a left turn lane, and an entrance lane on the connection to Centennial, so that there would be both dedicated right and left turn lanes for traffic exiting the subdivision. City engineer has reviewed the traffic study and has provided a memo that's in your packet, and has agreed that the only improvement needed to support this development would be the added left turn lane. We have all the easements needed, both utility and drainage, shown on the plat. All of the streets would be in dedicated public right-of-way and accepted for city maintenance. The applicants have indicated at this time that their preferred option would be to pay a maintenance fee to the city and to deed the pond over to the city for city maintenance. We have a process for that. So if we look at all the public improvements, that would be the responsibility of Aero Plains. There's about 9,300 lineal feet of internal streets, plus you have the 210-foot connection out to Centennial Road, plus they would be responsible for constructing the left turn lane on Centennial Road as an off-site improvement. They would be constructing sidewalks on both sides of all the internal streets. They would also be responsible for extending sidewalks on the section of Lindbergh Lane out to Centennial Road, and for designing a pedestrian path for school children and others, either as part of or next to the fire access road to connect to Foxborough Drive. They would be responsible for final design and construction of the detention pond and any storm inlets or pipelines needed to get water there. They would be responsible for design and construction of all internal public water mains and public sewer lines. So those would be amongst the improvements. Then in terms of impact fees payable to the city, there would be a payment of the benefit fee for the 12-inch water line, and then payment of the pond maintenance fee if applicable, and then park impact fees which be collected at the building permit stage. So there is a conceptual or preliminary phasing plan, and that phasing plan would involve 75 lots east of the line shown on that drawing, and that would also involve construction of the interim emergency access road. And that emergency access road, as we noted, works for phase 1 but does not work for full build out of the subdivision. The second phase would be construction on the 94 lots east of Wright Lane, and that would require a second public street connection in order for that to move forward. In terms of financing, they're not seeking special assessment financing, but are planning to use RHID financing to help fund the public infrastructure for this development. It's not clear at this time whether there will be covenants and an architectural review committee for the townhomes. We would clarify that with the applicant on the final plat. and at this time, there's an indication that a homeowners association would maintain those green spaces or common areas shown on the plat. So our future land use map for the city shows this as appropriate for suburban residential development, which has a density range of 4 to 8 units per acre, and the density here would be 6.35 housing units per acre, which is right in the mid-range of that, that density range. And our plan says that new growth should occur in contiguous manner adjacent to existing development supported by public infrastructure. In staff's opinion, this subdivision is being done in a contiguous manner adjacent to existing development and is supported by public infrastructure. In terms of connectivity, as we noted, Centennial Road's an arterial street. If there is a future connection to Virginia Drive is classified as a collector street, and the master plan is for Virginia Drive to extend from Magnolia to Schilling. School children can reach Schilling Elementary via Foxborough Drive and a sidewalk on the north side of Schilling Road. As we noted, there would be no busing of students from this subdivision to Schilling Elementary. So we have laid out on page 11 a summary of possible findings in support of approving this preliminary plat for Aero Plains Addition. And then on page 12, if you concur with our finding that Centennial Road is a direct access perimeter street, and you believe that the review criteria for preliminary plats have been met by this application, and you wish to approve this preliminary plat application, our recommendation would be that approval be subject to the 9 conditions that we've outlined on page 13 of your report. And number 1 is that the applicant would be responsible for all public improvements shown on the preliminary plat and preliminary infrastructure drawings. Those would include any improvements to Centennial Road determined to be required by the traffic impact study. That would mean the southbound turn lane on Centennial would be the responsibility of this development. And those improvements would all have to be made before there's any building permits issued for phase 1. On the final plat, there would be a final phasing plan that would have to be approved by the Planning Commission. There would need to be lot grading drainage plan for each development phase submitted to and approved by the city engineer. All utilities, including electric lines, would have to be placed underground. An interim emergency access road shall be constructed from the north end of Foxborough Drive to Lindbergh Lane as part of phase 1, and that would need to be complete and in place before there were any building permits issued. There would have to be a second public street connection to an existing public street, meeting the remoteness criteria in the fire code prior to any development occurring in phase 2. We would need the city engineer and director of utilities to approve the preliminary plans and specifications for internal public utilities and for the left turn lane on Centennial. We would need a letter from the city engineer approving the final drainage design and runoff calculations prior to considering a final plat, and then there would be a need for section corner ties and subdivision and block corners and a curb data table to be submitted with any final plat. In the alternative, if you don't think this is ready for your consideration and action today, you could postpone action or consideration if you feel additional information is needed to take action. If you find that the criteria related to public infrastructure or connectivity have not been met, then a motion could be made to deny the plat, citing what criteria have not been met. And so, as we noted, to assist the commission in your deliberations, we have provided a traffic impact study We have provided cross-sections of the proposed levee crossing with the slopes and the cross-section of what the elevation change is. We have provided the information about the sanitary sewer profile, which confirms that you can gravity drain this entire subdivision to the southeast corner. There's a drainage study that provides information about the additional runoff and how it will be detained. And then, just for informational purposes, we do have other subdivisions in the community that are affected by, when we're talking about gas pipelines, we're talking about gas distribution pipelines, not just a gas line that serves a subdivision or dwellings. And so there are pipeline providers have their own set of restrictions that govern what gets built over a pipeline easement or what can intrude into that easement. And so this is impacted by that, but you may or may not know there's a high-pressure gas line that runs right through the middle of Lowe's parking lot that has vents and vent stations on it. So there is high-pressure gas pipelines that do run through the city and other locations, so this isn't completely unique from that standpoint. But with that, that's a rather long-winded report, but we wanted to make sure we covered all the aspects of the criteria that you're to consider. And at this point, I'd be open to any questions that commissioners might have, or if you want Dustin to go back to a particular drawing or view, please let us know.
Okay. Any questions for staff?
Dean, I just had one, and this is more for my own clarification. On page 14 of the traffic study, and I agree with the end result of the traffic study. I don't think there's going to be any big impact here at all. But it said that they were using information from the trip generation manual by the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and that said on an average weekday, 7.2 vehicle trips per dwelling unit. Is that seems high to me? Is that?
Well, actually, for it's kind of a scale that reduces essentially the higher the density form of housing, the lower the average trips per day. So in a single-family setting, the accepted norm in the ITE, which is used nationwide, is right around 10 vehicle trips per day for each individual household. So if you were looking at a purely single-family residential subdivision, the average trip generation rate per individual single-family home would be about 10 trips per day. And so because these are attached townhomes, the accepted nationwide average is 7.2 vehicles per day, and it's slightly lower for that till you get to higher density forms of apartments or residential. Then the number of trips generated per day is less. But the characteristics of single-family homes is tending to have multiple vehicles, multiple drivers.
Right.
And when you get into denser forms of housing, so the initial rate for single-family would have been something on 9.82 or 10 trips per day. So while that number may seem high, that's the national accepted norm from the International Trip Generation Manual, and it is actually slightly lower than if this were single-family detached homes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Dean, we were at the last meeting where we discussed this. We talked about the Phase 1 and Phase 2. And Phase 1 is the emergency access road that we got going in, and one other or one other road to go in and out of this. Are we still looking at Phase 2 when Phase 2 is ready to go, of having 2 ways in?
Yes, that's the recommended condition on condition number 6 on page 13 of the report. Means that a second public street connection to an existing public street that meets the remoteness criteria shall be made prior to any development occurring in Phase 2. So that could be this, it could be this, but if all we have is access here and emergency access here, and those are the only 2 options we have, then Phase 2 can't move forward until one of these other options that connects to another public street is made.
Okay.
And then as the fire marshal has characterized the Foxborough as an interim emergency access because it only works for Phase 1, and then the other aspect of that is if there is a second street connection made up here to Virginia Drive, then this emergency access becomes unnecessary, and it could just be removed or come out. It's there on an interim basis and makes Phase 1 work, but it does not make the entire subdivision work.
But just to clarify, the access for the kids to get to school would stay permanent, though, right?
Yes, there's a dedicated easement for that. So even if the fire road came out, there would be a pathway for children. And like I said, I don't know which direction it'll go, but there is a possibility that if that is not viewed as providing a needed or identified level of flood protection that has to remain in place, then the crossing there could basically be brought down to grade level, which would facilitate both pedestrian and vehicle access.
Anybody else got any more questions for staff? Would the applicant like to add anything before we move on?
Good afternoon. I would just like to say thank you for taking the time to look at this with us and see if you have any questions for us.
Have you had a chance to look at the 9 recommendations, and are you on board with those?
Yes, we are, and yes, we have.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, anybody from the public like to comment on this?
Good afternoon, Chairman Hay,
Good afternoon.
Commissioners. My name is John Blanchard. I'm not only a resident of Salina, Kansas, but I am a landscape architect and land planner. I've been following your 2 prior meetings prior to this, and so I won't kind of go over some of the good quality questions that you guys had asked before. I would say at the outset, I'm not opposed to this development at all. I just think that there are a number of things that need to be taken into consideration from a practical standpoint, and they kind of generally fall into a number of categories. One is the emergency access that you folks have talked about quite a bit. I don't have a fire issue with the whole thing, and although it is about 3.5 feet on one side and 4.5 feet on the other side, I don't think that that's a practical problem. As far as it sounds like, though, that the discussion goes to, can we get fire equipment in and out efficiently, versus the true reason why planners really want to have at least 2 points of ingress and egress. And those ingress and egress points actually ought to be strategically planned. A couple of considerations for how not just the Foxborough interim and the main entry on Centennial work, but also the future extensions to Centennial have inherent questions involved with them, as do the layout of how the connection to Virginia Drive is made. And if you drive through Virginia Drive and you kind of plot that out to its final conclusion, there can tend to be some serious questions at what has to happen with Virginia Drive on the south side, not so much by Menards, but what really has to happen there. And I'm sure it was just sort of glossed over, just a broad stroke on the access drive, but it goes right through Keir's home, right through their homestead, and through their property. And I don't know if they've been approached to say, hey, are you guys okay with this? But my assumption would be they're not. Now, as far as, you know, it's been brought up a lot. This is a landlocked property, so there are general concerns based with it. Not only are you in a flood-prone area, but you have a high-pressure gas line going through the site, south to north, and you're entering in through an industrial center. And if you can imagine, it was brought up that says, you know, firefighters, you know, we can get in anywhere. We'll just bulldoze through. I think that's what the fire marshal said, and I believe that to be true. They're pretty, they adapt and they're able to do things. My concern from a planning perspective is not the ability for someone to get in to fight a fire or to EMS or whatever. It's the ability for residents to evacuate if necessary. I'll throw out a scenario because a lot of times I'll say, well, you know, what are the chances of something like this happening, an emergency happening? Well, if you can place yourself out in that neighborhood or out in that vicinity, and you wake up one morning and there's a police vehicle or a fire vehicle driving around on a loud horn saying, you know, please evacuate, please evacuate. And let's just say that that's due to a hazardous leak of some sort from the industrial center. It's 79 units, and I don't know if that means 158 duplexes or if that's 79 duplexes. But if you can imagine what that mad scramble would be to get out of there, and you're exiting onto Centennial Road, you'd be exiting along with all of the industrial traffic that would be going all at one time. So your peak traffic would be on steroids. Now, you don't have to imagine too hard that something like that could happen. On March 1st, 2017, in the morning, the emergency vehicles were called out to Tony's Pizza. There was a 5,000-gallon anhydrous ammonia leak on their roof. City crews drove through neighborhoods on the loud horns telling people what was going on and to evacuate voluntarily. So these things aren't that unlikely, especially when you say we're locating this right adjacent to and emptying onto an industrial center. So it kind of makes some of that thing. And to kind of go along with my concern about not emergency vehicles getting in, but people being able to get out, I would like you to explore the possibility of making a condition that that emergency access road, whether it's interim or final, off Foxborough, not be locked, that it be accessible if people need to evacuate in a hurry and not wait for someone to show up with a key. I think that that road needs to be maintained, and it ought to be the responsibility of the city to maintain that crossing, so that there is the assurance that if we're going to do this, that it's not somebody else on that levee doing it. And then also, if that access becomes permanent, that there be serious consideration made that the residents in the existing neighborhood be brought into the process, because that is a load of traffic, especially if you connect onto Virginia Drive. That is a load of traffic that's going to come through their existing neighborhood. And if you ever lived at the end of a cul-de-sac and had that turned into a thoroughfare, it's really not doing great things for your property values or your psychological well-being. So, and then the other thing, with an existing future access out to Centennial Road, for the same reason of evacuation concerns, if anything should happen on the pipeline, and I appreciate there's one going through Lowe's, but nobody lives in the Lowe's parking lot, at least not yet. But if something should happen with that gas line and they say, stay off the gas line, people got no way to get out. if all of your emergency exits are north or are west of that pipeline. So I think there ought to be some consideration for other available exits. And also, another concern is that the prevailing winds in that area, in town, in the summer are out of the southwest, okay? So you're bringing everything over the top of Tony's Pizza facility, the biggest facility in town, over all of those neighborhoods. And so I think you have to make sure that there's some sort of emergency plan if you're going to have only one. It needs to be formal. It needs to be part of a home buyer's packet of going like, if you buy in here, this is something that you need to know, especially since there are no basements, because if you have a tornado coming and people are starting to flood out of that subdivision to go to grandma's house who has a basement, I think that there are issues here that go beyond just being able to get into a development to fight a fire. Like I said, I'm not opposed to this. I think if a developer wants to develop a piece of property, that's fine. There was a note made of timing. Personally, I think the timing on this subdivision would be when there's already development out there behind Menards that have developed Virginia Drive and can provide that as an access. But without that being the case, there should also be some consideration made for the future connections and who's responsible to pay for what, and through a benefit district or whatever that case may be. But I would just hope that you would make some of those considerations and realize that it is a very difficult piece of property, and not just because it's landlocked, but because you have 3 other major considerations. But thank you guys for your time and your willingness to serve. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know, Dean, he brought up a really good point that I never really did think about, but on that emergency access road, can it be not locked?
The initial plan would be for it to have a post and cable and have a Knox lock on it for fire department only, primarily for the point that Mr. Blanchard raised, that if you don't have something like that on it, then people are going to use the fire lane as if it's a street. And then if access is not restricted, then you have what's essentially a 20-foot wide street that people are going to think they can go in and out of if it's not restricted. It's not to say that it has to be, and I'll let Mr. Long weigh in on that, but if you don't have it restricted, it might as well be a street. And as to that point, it was always something that planning staff had discussed with the city engineer, that if there is some transition between preliminary and final plat and somehow that Foxborough would become a public street instead of an emergency access, then that, in our view, would necessitate having a separate mailing and public hearing for the residents of Foxborough Drive, because the notices they've received to date, they don't anticipate regular vehicular traffic coming down Foxborough Drive. So we would want to have an opportunity for them to have notice and be heard on that. So I will let Mr. Long address that. Most of our current fire access roads, for instance, there's one that connects the Chapel Ridge Apartments with the Central Mall parking lot. That has a barrier on it because residents of the apartments aren't supposed to use that to shortcut out. It's there for the fire department. So I will let Mr. Long address that. I did observe, and that's our error, and I'm not sure, but Dustin, there's a street connectivity map. There was version 1 and version 2, and version 1 is what was in the packet instead of version 2. So if you put that on the screen, I think we can clarify that.
Okay, while he's putting that on the screen, could it be such a scenario, though, that since in phase 1, that we leave that emergency access road open, so, I mean, not locked, so you have 2 ways in, 2 ways out. Then when we get to the second phase and it's built out with that extra road that will have the connectivity, then we can go and we can decide what we want to do with that road after that's done.
Troy Long, Fire Marshal, Salina Fire Department. The intent and what we have here is an emergency access. And it's locked and cabled or gated or however we do that for the purpose of making sure that it's accessible for us if we need it in an emergency. One of the things that we started doing a couple years ago is we check those annually to make sure that they're maintained, that there's not things blocking them. My biggest concern would be if you open this up as a, I mean, I guess if it went to a standard city street rather than being an emergency access, it wouldn't concern me. But if we're going to leave it at that 20-foot wide and somebody decides, looks like a good place to park my camper, I don't have to take up my driveway space. Now that emergency access is no longer accessible. It's not intended for day-to-day access into this new development, but as an emergency, so. Any other questions?
I guess I still have a problem with, can we go back to what I mentioned earlier? I mean, is there a way, or can we use that emergency access road during phase 1 to make sure we got 2 ways in and 2 ways out? Then once phase 2 starts, which you said that we're going to have to build
Right.
another road, then, I mean, you're going to have a barrier across it. All I'm asking, does it have to be locked with a Knox box on it? Can it be left in case there is an emergency, that folks need to get out of that area, can use that?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I guess I misunderstood your question.
Okay. Now, I'm not saying open it wide open and just
Sure,
let it
sure.
run back and forth. I'm saying,
Sure.
You got the gate across it, we just don't lock the gate. Somebody needs to get out for an emergency access out of that place, all they have to do is open that gate and they can get out. Now, if that gets to be a problem, then I think that's when the Salina Police Department steps in and, you start issuing citations for using that road on a non-emergency basis.
Right, yeah, no, I would agree. I think, padlocks, locks keep honest people honest. If it was just cabled with a hook or something and it, I suppose that would be something, that's not something we've done in the past. Like I say, when we label something as emergency access, we want to keep it use of an emergency. But, if that was a concern, I'm sure that we could figure out a way to facilitate that.
Okay.
I guess my comment on that is I think that becomes another issue of itself, because as soon as you start giving access to those people, I mean, you give that access, it's kind of like my kids, hey, close the door, close the cabinets when you do it. They're going to open it, go out, it's going to be left there. Somebody's not going to close it. Now who's coming back through? Now you're calling the police department to come maintain it. We're writing citations in and out. I mean, we've got other locations in this town that have an emergency access that's used strictly for an emergency access because there's one area in and out of a development area.
Right.
And there's always going to be scenarios of something can happen, but again, with the street access, and I do agree with what Mr. Blanchard said on the gas thing. I didn't think about that initially, but depending on where that line runs, there's ways to get around it even in phase 1, so that because there are no dead-end streets, there's other ways to get around those locations, which is where this development is at right now. So
I did want to clarify that the gas line is west of Foxborough Drive. So if you're coming from the east, you get to Foxborough Drive before you get to the gas line.
right. So if you can you pull the plat back up? So it runs right through there. So if something happened in that area, all the way to the east of that, if it happened on this lower end, then they can go up to the north, go to the west, drop to the south, still get back out, because it's not where the entrance is itself. So you've got other access points to get out through that during that time frame, whether that's going to be a tornado, whether it's a gas line explosion, whether it's a chemical leak. You have those situations where you're going to be able to get in and out. I mean, the cul-de-sacs on the backside of it are the same way. I mean, you're going to have to turn around and go back through, find another way to get out of some of those areas. I think we're fine with one entrance in and out based on the size of this on this first phase. I think we're making a lot of phase 2, but phase 2 is not going to happen. Those streets aren't going to be built out. They can't do this until something's done afterwards. And now whether that's 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years, you're now asking the city to maintain an emergency access. And like Dean said, at that point in time, it's only been sent as an emergency access. If we're going to turn it into a street, then we're going to have to redo this and let the public know that we're going to do a street now for those people going in and out, because it's no longer, and it's going to change the traffic on that. If it's emergency access, we use it once a year or never in 5 years.
Right.
If it's a street, it's going to be used daily.
I agree with that somewhat. I trust this engineering data from this traffic study, and you know, I don't see an emergency evacuation being much different than 7:40 in the morning, people heading to work, or vice versa, coming home. But let me just throw a hypothetical thing out there. Say there was an emergency out there that affected people. Would you not coordinate with the police department and look at the situation and say, okay, we need to open this up for people to evacuate?
And I was actually, the incident that Mr. Blanchard mentioned, I was actually on scene as one of the commanders at that incident when Tony's had the leak inside the building. And we did choose to evacuate, but that wasn't necessarily because of plume. I mean, a little. It was as much because of the water system. This was going into our wastewater, and there's a channel that runs right to the west of this development that runs all the way south. We actually had other city departments bring in dirt, bring in a front loader to dam that up so that it didn't get any further. And we evacuated based on, so when you talk about hazmat, you talk about parts per million. When we were doing our analysis of the area, trying to decide, you know, what's tolerable, what's not tolerable, we gave, and in those situations, majority of the time, you're going to have people defend in place, basically stay in their house, because it's safer in their house. You've got furnaces that are, you know, cleaning your area. If you don't have windows open, doors open, you're not really going to get any of that in your house. So, I mean, that is a good hypothetical situation. I can tell you that the new plant that they're building out there, a lot of that stuff is inside, between an interstitial space and the roof. Now all the valves throughout that facility have been changed out, and they're all an electronically monitored valve. We do a lot of training with them, a lot of work with them, just to make sure that that's a safer facility than what it was even 5 years ago. So I hope that answers your question.
Did want to circle back to a point that Mr. Blanchard correctly pointed out, that in your packet version was an earlier version of conceptual connectivity to the northeast, and if Mr. Hers could put up the correct map, we'll show you that the concept here doesn't actually get into the care property, but that you would have an extension of Virginia Drive that would come to roughly here, and then a tie back in this direction, which could occur north of implicating this property, so you could have the ability to have that connection without this is more of a long-term connection, and if everything develops around him, Mr. Kerr may not think he's rural anymore and may want to seek a different rural location. But as this area changes and develops, this option of going north then east would allow for that extension without having to get into the Kerr property. And I observed that the map that was in the packet was an earlier concept that we discussed with the applicants, and it was all agreed that using Yeager Lane to go straight north and then over was preferred to going straight east. So I apologize that we didn't have that. This is the one we had displayed last week, but it was not the packet insert. So this is the idea for the 3 possible street connections outside the subdivision.
Any more questions?
I shared the same concerns last time we met about connectivity. Why could we not work on the infrastructure of the road that will connect the middle the middle road there? I'm not talking about Virginia, but what's that? Yes, that one right there. Why would that not be a suitable ingress, egress for phase 1? Is the city not prepared to work on that road, or how is that?
We don't own that property. The owner of Vision 1 purchased that property, and so we would have to coordinate the timing of that with his plans. If he had a subdivision plat that he brought forward for that property, we would make sure that street alignment was part of that plat. But if he doesn't move forward with a plan to develop that property, then we're dependent on his timing. From our perspective, or at least what we know, this, from a timing standpoint, this property is more likely to develop sooner than this property over here. So we're seeing this as the most likely scenario, and even if you did this, you'd get another way in and out, but it might not be sufficiently remote. So this, of course, would be ideal, but this seems more realistic in the near future than the road straight up to Magnolia.
And that connection to Virginia, that's not set in stone either?
No, it's not set in stone, but there is interest expressed in developing that property that makes that construction of that segment of Virginia Drive more likely to occur by the time these developers are ready to do phase 2 than the route straight north to Magnolia.
And I understand phase 2, and I think that would be a tremendous egress point, but I'm concerned about the residents in phase 1. I'm obviously not, well, I'm not obviously, I am not in, I do not want a thorough street to go into Fox Run or Foxborough Drive down there. I think that's, the emergency access I think is good. I think there does need to be a padlock on there. Otherwise, people will open that gate and they'll go through there anytime they want. But I am concerned about the residents in phase 1 in case, I mean, we are the planning commission. We need to plan for things like this. Fire access is one thing, and that's beautiful. I'm glad fire is able to get in there, but what about the residents that are in there? And we're increasing the traffic on Centennial Road by 55% per this traffic study. I have that concern. And I don't know the answer.
I don't know that I agree with that 55% number. Can you tell me where you got that?
That was in the traffic study.
That was in staff's report. That was in the traffic study and our summary that the base number is right around 4,400 vehicles a day, and this would add 2,448 vehicles to that. That's at full build out, not phase 1
and phase 2. not
That's phase 1 and 2 is 2,448 vehicles a day, but we have we have 75 lots, which is 150 units, Phase 1, and we have 94 lots times 2 for Phase 2. So it's going to be something like 40% of that 2,448 number in Phase 1.
I guess I share the same concern as Chad, just with having just one in and out for the people that live there. But I don't see a great solution. If we were to go with one, we're dumping 2 streets out onto Centennial. All the traffic's coming out there. And then we're not prepared to really move forward with anything else without further
Well,
addition.
constructing this gets a second way out of the subdivision and conceivably can disperse some of the traffic. It just doesn't get you two locations that are remote from each other in terms of the second access. But this would be a second way of means out, and it would be a way to disperse traffic so that you don't have 100% of the vehicles here. But this is property owned by Smoky Hill Construction. There's a cell tower to go around there, and this is owned by the Salina Airport Authority. Whether they're interested in making the same arrangement as here, that hasn't been determined, but that was at least identified as a future alternative.
But we have areas in Salina right now that have one access point to them. I mean, there's several community, I can't even think of what it is, but off of Marymount Road up by, it used to be the Elks, the Great Life. You've got a residential area in there that has one access point in and out. The entire community, if there's an emergency, is coming in and out of one access point. Off of Iron Street, you've got another community there by the dike that comes in, comes out. There's one access point to it. So it's not a new concept with it. I mean, when you have your emergency services coming back in and looking at, okay, the total volume of here's what it is, and that's why there's a Phase 1 and Phase 2 to be able to get in and out of that access point. And I agree that once you do Phase 2, that you're going to have another point there. They may never be able to do Phase 2 if the other parts aren't developed and a road doesn't go into it. But at this point, the first part, Phase 1, at least from a traffic study-wise by our fire chief, fire marshal, safety, in and out access, we have safe areas for them to be able to get in and out. We have 2 access points to be able to get into it. Yes, they're close, but it gives you 2 points. That entire street system loops around, so if you have one area blocked off, you can go another direction and get in and out. I mean, I don't have a concern with it at all. I mean, we've had other areas and street discussions and access roads in and out and emergency access, and I think unfortunately we're getting tied into Phase 2, which is going to be taken care of by part of the recommendations. That part's not occurring until those other streets are there. Now, I would agree with you. I'd like to see all 3 of those. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
probably the one on Centennial doesn't. Yeah, I'd like to see the one going straight up to Magnolia because that would make great sense for that whole area. But then that also means that whole area is probably developed out. So now you have residential areas in there, and if the gentleman from Vision 1 bought it, then that's probably what he's looking for. So you tie that back into it. The Menards area, if that goes into residential, now you have another street coming in and out of that, and you can plan that part of it to make sure that you have access. Yeah, I mean, you're not going to go against somebody's property that's obviously agricultural at this point, and they're not going to give you access just to go in and out of that. But if that whole thing develops out as it will probably be, based on what the city's trying to do, and if Tony's continues to expand and everything else, you're going to have multiple access points in and out of that.
In the future.
Yeah, in the future. But the future that's not built yet, it can't go in until the future. Those points have to go in for the rest of that to be developed. Phase 1 is all that we're really concerned about at this point in time. So I don't think that we really have a huge issue with the volume of units going in here and the traffic coming off of Centennial right now into this area.
I think the traffic study supports that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's, any different than any place else in town. Is it a perfect scenario? Absolutely not. But one thing's for certain, if we don't get this phase 1 done, there won't ever be a phase 2.
Right.
No, I agree.
This is a workable program for.
And I'm not against this subdivision. I think it's a well-needed here in Salina. I'm trying to come up with viable solutions to a problem. There's going to be construction equipment in the streets, in phase 1, while they're trying to move residents in there. And who says a concrete
Phase 1's going to
truck?
be built before you start having people move into it. You'll
that
go through
true?
and you'll build phase 1. Once phase 1 is completed,
won't.
now you start selling those lots and having.
They'll
people
have to
move
have all the streets 100%
Yeah,
complete and
everything
everything in
completed.
before,
That makes a difference.
before anybody starts building houses.
And phase 2 technically can't get started until they have the other access points, or they have to go in and actually build those streets to build the rest of it to be able to go back in. Because they can't go in and build the lots and put the stuff on there until the streets are built.
Mr. Mike, so in answer to your earlier question, Mr. Hers and I have done the math, and so one of the things that the traffic study did not do was break it down into phase 1 and phase 2. But if phase 1 is developed, it will increase the number of vehicles per day on Centennial by 1,086 additional vehicles per day.
That's a 24-hour period.
That's a 24-hour period, as opposed, the 2448 number is a full build-out. For phase 1, it'd be an additional 1,086 vehicles a day. That is a 25% increase over existing, as opposed to 55% increase at full build-out. So one of the things the traffic study did not do was break down the vehicular increase for phase 1 versus phase 2. So the report says 2,448 additional vehicle trips per day. That's at 100% build-out. The number for phase 1 is 1,086 vehicles per day for phase 1 build-out, and that's a 25% increase in traffic as opposed to 55%, which would occur at full build-out.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else from the public like to comment? We have anybody online that would like to?
Does not appear we have anybody that wants to speak online.
Okay, if not, I will bring it back to the commission for action or more questions.
So one place to start in your deliberations and discussions is to look at page 13, where staff has outlined possible conditions of approval on the preliminary plat. And you could look at those and see if any of those conditions you would think the language needed to be modified or the language needed to be added to have an additional requirement or clarification. So if there was a preference for how the interim emergency access road would be gated or used or accessible, if you looked at condition number 5, it just requires that it be constructed as part of the development of phase 1, and it has to be complete and in place before we issue any building permits. If you wanted to qualify how it's gated or made accessible or anything, that would be a place to look at that. And we would be available as you deliberate to answer any questions you have about the 9 conditions that staff had outlined as possible conditions of approval.
I don't. I think the only one that I probably have a question back to is the proposed street names too, on 2 of them that may be possibly tied to, similar to some of the other streets that you had talked about.
Well, and Mr. Long can weigh in on that as well, but what what we try to emphasize is that it's when somebody's coming and making a 911 call, it's going to be based on what the street name sounds like, not necessarily what it's spelled like. So our discussion was if you left Holly Lane as Holly Lane, that sounds just like Holly. So to differentiate that, they were proposing to call it Steve Holly Lane. So if somebody called in and said, we have a fire on Steve Holly Lane, we don't think that that would be confused with Holly Lane. That's a judgment for the Planning Commission. The same with Rogers Lane being changed to Tim Rogers Lane. We think that's sufficiently different in terms of what it would sound like on a call, but I'll let Mr. Long comment on that.
And that is a couple of the names that I brought up when we talked about this plat initially. Technology is better than it used to be, and I would say if everybody was still using landlines, there wouldn't be an issue because that landline address comes up on the dispatcher's monitor and says this is where they are, and so they can say that. However, I think landlines are quickly becoming a thing of the past, and so now we start talking about cell phone triangulation, and if people figure out how to turn GPS off on their phone or something like that, and we make a cell phone call, it is very important that we have names that are differentiated from other names we might have in the city. And so Holly Lane was one, and Rogers, we have a Rogers Court, not far from here. So that's why I asked that we do something to differentiate that from Rogers Court.
What about the Armstrong?
The Armstrong, it's probably necessary to do something, the first name in front of that. I'm not an airplane guy. I'd have probably said Louis Armstrong. I don't think that's correct. I think it's somebody else.
Try Neil.
So, yeah, I would like to see a name in front of that, a first name in front of that, so.
Okay.
And I think I'd agree with it, too. I think if you threw Louis in there, it confuses everybody.
It's the Jazz Airport District.
So is somebody ready to make a motion?
I will. I would make a motion to approve application P 22-1 filed by Building Kansas LLC for approval of the preliminary plat with the staff recommendations on page 13, 1 through 9, and also a change of Armstrong Lane to include a first name.
Okay.
I'll second that motion.
Got a motion and a second. Any more discussion?
I would like, on number 5, I think Dean brought this up, as far as that emergency access road, I would like for that to be gated and locked.
I think that's what
And I
we're
think
talking about now.
It is.
Yeah.
It will be.
Does it need to be delineated in there, in the motion?
I think the default position of the city is that those are gated and locked, so that wouldn't need to be a special, that would be, it would only if you didn't want it to be gated or locked that you'd need to modify that. But the assumption is that if it's constructed, it would, emergency means that it's for the fire department only.
That was my only concern.
Okay.
And so they would just get a Knox lock.
Sure.
The company that we use for all of our secure systems, that they would put on that for us to be able to access that.
Sure.
Nobody else can.
I just didn't want it to be an access road through
No,
Foxborough.
I agree.
I agree.
Thanks.
Yep.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. That passes 5-0. We'll move down to 3.2.
I would just remind the Planning Commission that you made a recommendation earlier on what the zoning of this property should be. That was a recommendation to the City Commission, and that recommendation isn't going to move forward till the City Commission until you acted on this today, so that will go to the City Commission for their first consideration. And then again, to remind the commission that this is a preliminary plat, so when they come back with a final plat, you'll get another look at this with just a slight higher level of detail. But this is the development concept, and then you will come back and review the final plat before this becomes final. So just wanted to share that with the commission.
Okay. So we'll move to 3.2.
Item 3.2 is a public hearing on a conditional use permit application that was filed by Alicia Thompson. And her request is for approval of a conditional use permit that would allow her to establish and operate a group daycare home on Leslie Avenue, west of Roach at 735 East Leslie. And I think Mr. Hers has the maps and the report on this item.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. So the applicant, Alicia Thompson, is looking to establish and operate what we call a group daycare home. And what that is a daycare facility that is run out of her personal residence, in which she has a secondary assistant come in to help her, so that there are 2 care providers versus a typical licensed daycare. That's a home daycare. And as such, you can have up to 12 children, which is 2 more than what you can with a licensed daycare. So a licensed daycare allows for 10, group daycare allows for 12. So what we're looking at is a conditional use permit to see if the site is appropriate for a daycare that has 2 extra kids and an extra care provider. And so when we do this, we go through and look at the typical conditional use conditions. The first one is compliance with ordinances and requirements. And something that is a little bit interesting and unique about this property is that it is part of the Southern View Addition, which was platted in 1955, and the dimensions of the lots, we are in block 10. So Leslie, even though it shows Albert on the plat, this is actually Leslie, and so the distance of Leslie is 2 blocks. That spans blocks 9 and 10, and we are looking at specifically lot 12. These interior lots are all 65 feet by 120 feet deep. The corner lots are more. They're 75 and a half and 78 feet wide. So the interior 65 feet by 120. The reason that that's particularly interesting is because when you look at the zoning district of the property is along Leslie here for lots 9 and 10 are all single family. And that particular zoning district has a lower density requirement than what you typically see for R1, which is what you have in the surrounding area. And so we'll show you what that requirement looks like. There is a table in your packet on looks like page 3 that you can look at too, but it's also on the screen here. So what I did is I broke down the existing conditions of the applicant's property in relation to the required R and R1. So the plat itself was platted in 1955. The house was built in 1958. There was an addition to the back, to the rear. I'm going to get the arrow up again. A 22 by 24 living room addition was constructed in 1971, and then in 1977, the city of Salina had a comprehensive rezoning, and that comprehensive rezoning changed the zoning district for these properties to R, which is where the existing current zoning district that we have today. What that means is that zoning district has different requirements than what you typically see in R1. So the width of the site, as I showed you on the plat, is 65 by 120. The R minimum requirement is 70, and the overall minimum lot area is 8,500. The platted lot of record is 7,800. So what that means is it's pre-existing non-conforming as to the lot width and as to the lot area. Now, because it is a legally established lot of record and it was designed and built under the standards before it was rezoned to R, it's a legally non-conforming property. So what that means is, as we look at the particular application now, is that it doesn't disqualify it from a conditional use, but it does mean you may want to look at that and take that into consideration as to, is this lot wide enough and large enough for a group daycare home? So looking at welfare of the public and the convenience, the applicant believes that the proposed daycare will benefit the public because it'll add additional care for families in the neighborhood and within the Salina community. And staff would note that we did do a site visit, and that site visit consisted of the Saline County Health Department, our local fire department, our building services division that looks at building codes, and then planning. And during that site visit, we did do an inspection, and the only items that were not in full compliance were very minor things like coverings of the electrical outlets, and then fire alarm, fire smoke detectors being added. So those are items that were not quite all there yet, but those are minor items that can be addressed by the applicant as we go through the process. But other than that, the site met all of the requirements for all of those various entities. Looking at the surrounding properties and whether or not the proposed conditional use would cause any injury to the surrounding properties, the applicant states that there are no physical changes that she's proposing to the site. It will remain unchanged from somebody walking by or looking at the property, and there are no changes to the outside of the facility. Typically, when we have a group daycare home application like this, we have an established licensed daycare. This one is a little bit unique because the applicant just recently moved to this location. So she hasn't operated a licensed daycare or any kind of daycare at this site previously because she just moved here. And so in this case, we're going from what was previously just a single-family home to now a single-family home that's also going to have an accessory use of a group daycare. And so that's something to consider. The backyard is fully screened in with or fully enclosed rather, with a solid wood fence. We do have some pictures here to kind of show you what the property looks like. So this is the front, looking at it from Leslie. Again, from the front, looking at Leslie. It's got a 26-foot wide driveway, so you can park 2 cars in it rather easily, and a attached garage for a 3rd vehicle, an off-street parking stall. And here's another view of the backyard. So the backyard is fully enclosed with a solid fence. Staff would note that we did receive a email with concerns in opposition to the proposed conditional use permit, and that came from a neighbor that is directly to the east, and her primary concerns are of two major things in her mind. That would be one of increased traffic with children being dropped off and picked up, and the other being noise, and that those 2 items, the increased traffic and noise, could impact the resale value of her property. Staff would note that the vast majority of daycares in Salina are licensed daycares or group daycare homes such as this that are located in residential areas. And I know you guys are aware of that because we bring these to you fairly often, but that is something to keep in mind and consider. Looking at the domination of the neighborhood, you would look at the conditional use and whether or not it would dominate the immediate neighborhood. Again, the applicant isn't proposing any changes, so if you were just a regular citizen walking by, you would notice that it has anything different to it tomorrow or the next day if it's approved, or down the line if it's approved, versus if you were to walk by it and it was just a single-family residence. The house itself is rather similar to the other properties in the area. All of the properties were built in the 1950s, ranch-style homes that have similar characteristics. The biggest change would be the increased traffic, or the potential of the increased traffic. And how we would look at that is the group daycare home would be eligible to have up to 12 children dropped off and cared for here. Typically, you don't have 12 drop-offs and pickups. Typically, you have siblings that are involved in there somewhere, where you would have people dropped off, and maybe 2 or 3 at a time, depending on how many kids there are at that particular drop-off and pickup. But if you did have just one per drop-off and pickup, you would have 12 trips dropping kids off, another 12 picking them up for 24, and then you'd also have a care provider that would have 1 or 2 additional trips, depending on if they come and stay all day and then just leave. That'd be 1 trip. If they come and leave once and come back, that'd be 2 trips. So you're looking at, around 25, 26 additional trips a day, maybe less. We'd have the applicant kind of share with us how many drop-offs or vehicle trips that she would expect. If they have sets of brothers and sisters or siblings, it may be less than that. So that's what we're looking at for the increased traffic. We would also note that with daycares, because they're usually associated with the parent or guardian going to work or having to take care of other responsibilities, that those drop-offs usually happen in small windows, meaning 7:30 to 8 in the morning is when drop-offs usually happen, and then 5:30 is typically when pickups occur, and so there's not a lot of traffic generated throughout the day outside of those 2 windows. So we would just ask that the applicant kind of describe what she envisions being the situation in terms of how many drop-offs and pickups she would envision and when those would take place. Off-street access and off-street parking. The driveway itself is connected, as 26 feet wide, connected to Leslie, and there's 3 parking stalls, 2 in the driveway, 1 in the garage. And so that does meet the minimum requirements. The zoning regulations require single-family residents to have 2 off-street parking spaces, and they also require additional parking space for the care provider. In this case, there are 3 vehicle spots, or 3 parking spaces. The applicant has shared with us that her model or her operation that she sees is she would have a space in her garage for her vehicle, her husband would go to work, her care provider would come and use one of those 2 parking spaces in the driveway, leaving one open for drop-off and pickup, and if multiple parents arrive at the same time, they could use the curb along Leslie Street, which is just a 2-block street, so there's not a lot of traffic on Leslie. In fact, because it's only 2 blocks, we don't actually have traffic counts for it because it's so low. So I don't know what that means exactly, but it's probably, 1,500 or less, 1,000 cars less a day, something along those lines for sure. Staff comments and analysis. As I noted, Saline County Health Department did inspect the site, the fire department has, and our building services staff has, and it does meet all the regulations once the electrical outlets are child-proofed and the fire detection smoke alarms are installed. And so with that, we do have some alternatives on page 7 that you could look at. The first is that you could approve the conditional use permit as it's requested. If you feel that all of the requirements of the conditional use permit have been met and satisfied, you could approve the application subject to any specific conditions or revisions made to the plan. You could also postpone consideration if additional information is needed, or you could deny the application if you feel that it's not an appropriate site for a group daycare home and that it could possibly cause injury to the surrounding properties and the neighborhood around it. In this case, we do have some findings of fact for you to consider on page 7 that kind of summarize what we've talked about in our report. And we do have a condition that no more than 12 children may be cared for at any one time in accordance with state standards for group daycare homes. And then in the past, there are some instances where you have tied the approval of the conditional use permit to the operations of the applicant. I don't have that listed here, but if that's something that you would want to do here, we could add that, where if Ms. Thompson ceases to operate her conditional use permit or her group daycare home out at this facility, or she moves to a different location, that the conditional use permit would become void. So that's another condition that you could add if you wish to, but it's not necessary that you do. Most conditional use permits run with the land, but if there are certain situations where you feel more comfortable in tying it to the applicant, that's an option. So with that, staff would take any questions that you might have.
Dustin, is this under any kind of homeowners association or covenants and restrictions?
No, it is not. So the biggest criteria that you're looking at here is, does the use fit the area, and is the property large enough to conducively operate as a group daycare home? And so that's one of the reasons that I spent more time than usual talking about the requirements, because this site would meet the R1 conditions. It actually would meet the R1 conditions fairly easily, because the R1 conditions have a 6,000 square foot a minimum lot area requirement, a 60-foot lot width, and a 100-foot lot depth, and it would exceed all of those. And that's, I mean, R1 is our most prevalent residential district. And when Mr. Ander and I were looking at this, we were actually surprised that this is zoned R, because none of the lots conform except for the corner lots. I mean, they're completely non-conforming lots. All of these lots are within this subdivision. So it's a little peculiar. It probably should be zoned R1, but it's not. It's zoned R. And so the question then becomes, is it large enough to conducively operate a daycare without injuring or impacting the neighboring properties in a negative way?
Thank you.
Can you go back to the photo from the backyard?
Sure.
So I see the fence on the north, see the fence on the west. I'm assuming there's one on the east. Where's the fence
Yeah.
along the south?
Let's see here. See if I can get, if I have a picture. I don't know that I have a picture. Let's see if we can get it from the aerial photo. I think there's
Oh, right there.
is there a gate here? I'm not sure if, you may speak to the applicant about that. My memory is already foggy from that. Yeah, there may be a gate here, or maybe there's a retaining wall, or go ahead.
Step up, please.
My name's Alicia. I'm the resident at 735 East Leslie Avenue. Our landlord is currently in the process of working with a contractor to get that fence reinstalled, because when the windstorm came up, it took that fence down. So he's currently working with a contractor to get that south fence put back up.
It was just this location where I've got my cursor, is that right? Okay.
And then all the rest of the fence stayed up during that
Yeah.
windstorm? Okay.
Yep,
And then, so quick question, you made comment, your landlord, so you're not the owner of the property?
correct.
Okay. And then, assuming that you've had a daycare prior to coming to this property?
I did not. I am in the process of getting the daycare licensing.
Okay. So did you provide childcare prior to this then?
No, but I
So
do have.
brand new
Yeah.
or enterprise for you overall? Okay.
I think one thing we do want to clarify, though, that there was an email from Mrs. Shaw. You said that there was two things that she was worried about. She was worried about the excess traffic, more traffic coming in, and she was also worried about the sound. And I think one of her other concerns was the resale value of her property with a daycare being in the neighborhood. So I did want to make sure that, we did represent Mrs. Shaw on that part there. I do know that daycare in Salina is dearly needed. And so, we just want to make sure that the property and everything, from what I can see, is acceptable for that. So, but I just didn't, I did want to bring up that other and make sure Mrs. Shaw was represented in her concerns.
Absolutely, yes.
I guess I have one more question for the applicant. So are you anticipating doing pickup and deliveries, or are parents dropping kids off directly? I mean, are you going to be picking kids up from schools or preschools, those types of things? Or are you going to strictly be there, or I guess that's part of the question.
So that kind of depends on, right now we'll have two providers directly at the house, and then I'll have another one, because two has to stay at the house at all time with all the kids. And so if we do pickup and drop-offs at school, I will have a third person to do those drop-offs. That will just come, my mom will be probably the one to do those, and then she'll just be going home after those.
So she wouldn't actually be staying there, that you would have
Correct.
to supply another parking spot for?
Yeah.
Okay. So on the parking, Dustin, then that's only for the two full-time employees that they have to provide the spaces for, is that correct?
Yeah, so just to back up a little more, give us some more context to the situation. The city of Salina has what they call a home occupation ordinance that allows for certain home occupations that have limited impact on residential areas to take place in a person's individual residence. And all of those prohibit an outside party from assisting with that home occupation or that business coming onto the site. In other words, if you have a hair salon, which is a fairly typical one, we have several of those around town, you can have a single chair, you can provide hair service within your own residence by appointment only, but you can't have an assistant come in and take phone calls or work on your books, or a second hair provider. The only business where you can have an assistant is this, and that's why it requires a conditional use permit. And so typically you would just have one assistant care provider. In this case, it doesn't sound like her mother is really a third. It's somebody that does transportation and drops them off, and that's that. So it wouldn't really require any off-street parking, because it's not somebody that's staying there and providing care on site. It's somebody bringing children to the site, if that helps answer that question.
Yep, no, it does.
Okay, anybody got more questions?
Ms. Thompson, one of the things that was brought up was the number of vehicle trips per day. Are you expecting the, 24, 25 per day, or do you have any idea at this point?
No, I currently have 3 kids of my own, so I would only have 9 daycare children. And if they were to come each individually from separate homes, that would only be 18 pickup and drop-offs.
Okay. And as was stated before, one of the emails we received was concerned about noise. What kind of hours of operation are you looking at with this?
Just during the day, normal work hours, from anywhere from 7 to the latest 6 o'clock.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else got anything? Okay, thank you. Anybody else, anybody from the public would like to comment on this? Okay, if not, I'll bring it back up to the commission for action.
I think the only thing that I've ever, on these, and probably specifically in this situation, where the daycare operator's not the owner of the home, but that we would limit the conditional use to this applicant, meaning that if she left, then if somebody else wanted to do the same thing, they'd have to come back up and just make sure that they understood the whole process and what they were going through, and
I'd agree with that.
so.
So would that attach to the applicant if she relocated?
If she relocated, so if we do it as limit the conditional use to her only, then this because what we're doing is we're giving conditional
this
use
land.
to the property for her as the daycare operator. So if she leaves this property, they can't automatically have somebody else come in and become a daycare provider there with the group home type situation.
Thank you.
If she goes to another location,
She has to go through it again.
she'd get to do the
We
same.
have had a situation where we had a daycare provider that you approved a conditional use permit on Patty Lane, and then they relocated to Republic Avenue, and so they had to get a separate conditional use permit for the Republic Avenue location because it was a different location. So it's based on the location, not the operator.
Somebody ready to make a motion?
Yeah, I'll make a motion for approval application CU 22-2, subject to the conditions on page 8, stating following the standards of the state, no more than 12 children, and also limiting the conditional use permit to this applicant only.
Second.
Okay. Have a motion and a second. Any more discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, same sign. That passes 5-0. Thank you.
Thanks. Good luck.
Okay, that brings us to 3.3.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is 3.3 is a two-part application. It's been filed by Salina Rad Homes LP, which is a organization that's been formed locally associated with the Salina Housing Authority, and they have filed two requests. One is to amend the future land use map designation for property on the south side of West Cloud, west of Broadway, and then they have filed an application to change the zoning map classification of that property from manufactured home park and single-family to multifamily residential, and these have been submitted to allow construction of multifamily apartments on that location. And so I would ask, the first application is a request that relates to what we refer to as the former Shangri-La and then later Palos Verdes Estates Manufactured Home Park. And that is in an area that's currently designated as suburban residential land use. And I think so you can see that to the north and to the east is that area in brown is an urban residential designation. And so the request is to change the designation to urban residential, which would better align with their request for our 2.5 zoning. So essentially, they're requesting to expand this urban residential area and have it carry over into this area. And so your actions in response to that application would be to reaffirm the existing comprehensive plan and essentially maintain the map status quo as is. You could recommend that the future land use map be changed to show all of the south side of West Cloud all the way over to Haskett as future residential, if you think that a map amendment is justified, or you could recommend that the map be changed only for the 2.64 acre parcel, which would not include the La Mille Church or any of this property over here. The property that we're discussing is at the western edge of an existing urban residential land use area. It's also at the southern edge of one associated with the National Guard Armory. Broadway Boulevard is a major arterial street, and West Cloud is a minor arterial street, and this property is at the edge of a residential area, so staff doesn't see that the proposed change or proposed density should have any negative impacts on the surrounding area. And so for those reasons, we think an amendment of the future land use designation for this property can be justified. So again, in response to this, your options would be to leave the map, recommend that the map be left just as it is, which would not support a change for multifamily housing. You could recommend that the map be changed to encompass the area all the way over to Haskett, or you could recommend that the map be changed just for this area that's the intended site of the housing project. So with that, I'd be open to any questions that you have about this location or the neighborhood.
So the difference between, sorry, go back to the land map, land use. So
Could just focus.
the urban residential, which is in the brown, compared to the suburban residential, what's the difference between those two
It's
designations?
primarily a matter of density. The urban residential is designed to accommodate a density of anywhere from 8 to 20 units per acre. And so it's either indicative of smaller lots, closer together development. The suburban residential allows for townhomes and duplexes and other forms of housing, but it recommends that the density not exceed 4 to 10 units per acre. And so the density that's being proposed here at this location is more indicative of urban residential than it would be indicative of suburban residential. So the R2.5 zoning that's being requested is not listed as a potential zoning district in the suburban residential category, and so the request is to go to a classification of urban residential, which would be in support of their companion application, which is to rezone this to multifamily residential.
Gotcha. And then, so the two properties on the far west edge, those are currently residences?
Yes, and then you have a church in between. But obviously, we have large parts of the original parts of Salina residential neighborhoods that have smaller lots and a denser pattern that are shown as urban residential. Suburban residential is more indicative of larger lot, single-family residential, like the daycare that we just looked at, and urban residential is more for uses, duplexes, townhomes, and apartments that are arranged in a higher density. And so the comprehensive plan says if you're going to do a higher density, it should be at edges of defined neighborhoods along arterials and minor arterials, and this is at the edge of a defined neighborhood next to an arterial and a minor arterial. So we do think it meets the requirements or criteria for a denser housing, but the first step would be for you to look at the vision for future land use here and see whether you agree that a change is justified. It's shown as suburban residential because at the time the plan was adopted in 2010, this was still a manufactured home park that had 20 units in it, and so that was indicative of a low-density pattern.
So what are the three properties on right through there? There's three.
One of those is the gym, which is a private weightlifting club. Another one is a rental home. And then this is an unusual building that's, through its history, has mostly been used for automobile repair off and on. We addressed that in more detail in our zoning report, but the parcel that we're talking about does not include this. It goes around that boundary.
Okay.
But we could do the urban residential designation and cover all of those properties.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, because when you're looking at land use plan designations, you're your lens should be. You should be looking at from a higher altitude view and not looking just at an individual parcel. But there's a case to be made because of it's kind of, those properties are all kind of related to each other from Haskett over to Broadway, and then it's when you get west of Haskett that you're really back into lower density single family. But it would be the commission's choice whether to change the designation at all or to limit it just to the 2.64 acres that we're looking at a zoning request for.
Is there any negative impact, Dean, to the other property owners in terms of the designation?
Well, I mean, it's all a matter of perception. The land use designation it's just laid on top of the already existing uses. So you can see that the armory here has got an urban residential designation. Well, it's not a residential property, but the development characteristics of the property are closer to urban residential. And so it's just an indication that urban residential is a denser pattern. You expect a higher in density and more intensity than you would in suburban residential, and urban residential anticipates that there might be some convenience retail or service or office or other things that you wouldn't have in suburban residential. But things, churches, civic uses, offices, limited retail or service are all things that you would expect in an urban residential neighborhood that you wouldn't have in the suburban pattern.
So you said churches was one of those.
Churches is one of those, yes.
Did we hear anything from the people in that area?
We did. I was going to save that for the zoning part of this, but we sent out a letter indicating the changes that, and the owner residents that I talked to were not concerned about the use. They were concerned about drainage, and they had reported that they, in their view, have either plugged or too small storm sewers on Smith Avenue, and they didn't want the majority of the runoff from this directed to Smith Avenue. But they said other than that, they don't have any concerns or objections to the proposed use. The site plan that was submitted was sent out in our mailing, so the residents got a picture of what was being proposed. And so the only thing that I got in the way of feedback was we sure hope they don't drain all that to the south on Smith. So that was the only comment that we got.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Anybody from the public like to comment on this?
We do have representatives of the applicant. They're joining us via Zoom.
Does the applicant, would they like to add anything to this first part?
No, sir, we did not have anything. Mostly, I guess it would be for the second part instead of this first part.
Okay.
Again, this first part is just big picture. Do you see this as a site that could support a higher density than a manufactured home park?
Okay, no more questions. We'll bring it back up to the commission for action.
I guess I would, according to what Dean told us there, I would include the church. I don't know if the other two properties to the west of that. I mean, from a strategic standpoint, Dean, is it easier for you guys to deal with complete blocks or not?
No, it's just when you're looking at the comprehensive plan or future land use plan, we just try to look at it from a higher altitude view, and so we look at it as a bigger picture. But if you felt comfortable going from Broadway over to the west edge of the church property, that would be a perfectly reasonable amendment, and we would reflect that accordingly.
But if we changed it, the residents that are currently there, nothing.
Yeah,
happened to
the
them,
comprehensive
nothing-
plan doesn't affect how people use their property on a day-to-day basis. That's zoning. It's just what the comprehensive plan does is it just says, this is how the city views, if there was a development or redevelopment, this is how the city views this property for future use.
So the only thing that would benefit running it all the way to Haskett is, say at some point, the developers of this property or another property comes in and they buy those other 3 lots and say, hey, I want to go in and do something a little bit higher density. They don't
Or-
come back in and have it changed again.
Or the church is gone and then if somebody were able to acquire all the property over to Haskett and say, we have these nice apartments here, we want to do something just like it here, it would essentially be saying that in the future that such a use of that would be supported.
I think that seems reasonable to go all the way to Haskett.
I do too.
Yeah.
I think it keeps it from getting spotty.
Yeah. On that note, are you ready for a motion? I'd make the motion that we approve application M22-1 all the way over to Haskett.
I'll second that. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any more discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Passes 5-0. That
Now-
brings us to
We have done
B.
We have Part B of this is the specific request to rezone this property from manufactured home park in R1 to R2.5, which would be a zone that would be needed to allow multifamily housing. And so the specific request is that the Salina Rad Homes has a contract to purchase the former Palos Verdes Estates manufactured home park, and it's located in that area you see there. You can see in the aerial photo what looks like racetracks. That's the old roads from the manufactured home park. At one time, it was established in 1953, and it was actually a county trailer park, and then it was annexed by the city in 1957. At one time, it was licensed for up to 35 homes, and then it was reduced to 20 homes. And the request is to change the zoning classification to R2.5. And if this request is approved, the plan is to construct a 48-unit apartment complex that would have 1, 2, 3, and 4-bedroom apartment units and a leasing office. And so on page 2 and 3, we have a description of the project from the applicants. They indicate that the complex and unit amenities would include professional landscape lawns, a playground, multi-purpose space with kitchenette, a smoke-free housing environment, frost-free refrigerator in all units, 4 ADA accessible units, common on-site laundry, a leasing office, and a community room. You can see that the breakdown is anticipated to have 6 one-bedroom apartments, 16 two-bedroom, 20 three-bedroom, and 6 four-bedroom apartments for a total of 48 living units. The estimated construction cost is $11 million. So we've kind of highlighted some of the development standards. We have a front yard setback requirement of 25 feet from the property line or 75 feet from the center line, whichever is greater when you're dealing with an arterial street, and 55 feet from center line on a residential street like Smith. The side yards requirements are 7.5 feet on each side of the building, so that would be west and east. And this property does not have a rear yard because it has 2 front yards. You need to, in the R2.5 district, you have to have at least 2,000 square feet of land area per family, and this is proposing 2,395 square feet per family. The maximum structure height is 75 feet, and these are going to be 2-story units. And then our parking requirements is you have to have 2 spaces for the first 20 dwelling units, and then 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit for each unit above 20. And the number of spaces they're proposing on here meets our requirements. They have 2 front yards, and they're required to have 2 front yard landscape buffers, which they are showing on Cloud Street and Smith Avenue. And they would be allowed to have a ground sign up to 32 square feet and 3 total signs. So this property has been a trailer park or mobile home park since the 1950s. All but a small portion have been zoned manufactured home park since that time. Neither the current owner or the prospective owner wish to redevelop the property as a manufactured home park. They see this as more suitable for other forms of housing, particularly multifamily. And as we indicated, there's 380 feet of frontage on Cloud, and it's 300 feet deep. It's currently vacant, and staff believes it's suitable for new infill development. And the applicant believes that the current manufactured home park zoning inhibits their ability to redevelop the property at a suitable density. So, certain factors make this property less appropriate for single family and more suitable for some form of multifamily, and that would include the frontage on an arterial street, the proximity to Broadway, having the National Guard Armory across the street, the church to the west. Those factors may not be viewed as positives for single-family redevelopment, and so the applicant believes that the manufactured home park is no longer suitable and inhibits the development of this site to its highest potential. The other thing, staff would note that it's pretty difficult within the city to find a 2.64 acre tract of land that's contiguous under one ownership that has arterial street access. So having those characteristics makes this suitable for some form of multifamily housing. Although we have mixed uses to the east, including the former Rocket Square Motel, you have the Lummiel Church to the west, the Armory to the north, and although there's not that much R2.5 zoning in the vicinity, we do think that this meets the locational criteria for multifamily housing. The rear yard, the apartment buildings would abut the front yard of homes on Smith, but the way that they have this set up, essentially the setbacks would line up and match with the homes on Smith. And so the question for you to consider is whether with that proposed building setback and the landscaped rear yard and the 6-foot fence that's being proposed, does that provide a sufficient buffer between the apartment development and the single-family homes to the south and west? We have a 6-inch water main in Cloud and in Smith, and those would be interconnected to provide for fire protection. I think, Mr. Hers, if you went to the site plan, we'd see their proposal to add fire hydrants to the site, and essentially they would be running a connecting fire line between Cloud Street and Smith Street that would serve fire hydrants to provide fire protection. There is no sewer in Cloud Street, so they would tie back into the sanitary sewer in Smith. And there's no storm sewers in Cloud, and there is a storm sewer in Smith, but staff, as I noted, was contacted by concerned residents on Smith who are primarily concerned about not having the site runoff go to Smith. And so the plan is to grade the site to drain to Cloud Street. Then it would go west on Cloud to a large set of storm sewer inlets at Haskett and Cloud. And from there, the storm sewers get progressively larger till they get to Tally Drive, which goes to the west, and there's a 60-inch box that carries storm sewer west all the way to Dry Creek, which crosses the interstate there right at Cloud Street. So all the runoff from this site would end up going to the west and end up in Cloud Street. The only other thing we'd note about Cloud Street that's unusual. It's an arterial street, but it only has 50 feet of right-of-way, and so the south right-of-way line for Cloud is right behind the curb. The fire response for this site would be from station number 2 on South Santa Fe. This property is in the Schilling Elementary School, South Middle School, and Salina High School enrollment areas. I do believe that this would probably be in the category of a site where busing would be provided to Schilling School. Cloud carries 5,500 vehicles a day, and Mr. Mike Sell had commented on the trip generation rates for different types of uses. We've calculated this one from the Institute of Traffic Engineers at about 7.3 vehicles per day per dwelling unit, or about 351 trips that would be generated. We estimated that when the mobile home park was there, that generated between 160 and 280 vehicle trips per day, so you're looking at that incremental increase. The opening on Smith is designed and intended primarily for emergency access, although you can see that it's fully available for vehicles to go in and out. It's just with the signalized intersection at Cloud and Broadway, there's not many people that are going to try to use Smith to access Broadway, but it would not be chained or gated. It would be a fully open driveway. So you have just recommended that this be changed to urban residential on the land use plan, and so that would support R2.5 zoning and a density being proposed here of 18 units per acre. We think that the location and the development criteria are met from the comprehensive plan, and so we've outlined some findings on page 8 of your report. The manufactured home park zoning is not desirable, and it inhibits redevelopment of this property, for which we think is capable of supporting higher density. Because of the nature and intensity of nearby uses and being at the edge of a neighborhood, we don't see this as adversely affecting the surrounding neighborhood or nearby properties. From what we can tell from our interaction with the neighbors, they don't view it as a negative. We have public utilities and services in place. We think the locational features are consistent with the locational preferences for multifamily housing, and there is an identified need for additional rental housing units in the community. So option 1 is you could recommend approval of the applicant's request for R2.5 zoning as requested. You could recommend a lesser change to a lower density, which would not allow the 48 units. You could recommend that this be postponed to a future meeting date to allow additional information to be provided, or you could recommend denial of the request for R2.5 zoning. Our recommendation would be approval of the request based on staff's suggested findings. We did want to point out that this site plan is for illustrative purposes. It's not something that the Planning Commission is voting on per se, but as Planning Commission members, you're certainly free to offer any comments or suggestions on the applicant's conceptual plan or to ask questions about it. So with that, staff would be open to any questions you have or to go back to any of the maps or graphics that we've displayed.
Okay, anybody got any questions for staff on this?
So on the parking for this, so they would have to provide, what, 42 parking spots based on the total of 48 total units? Is that correct? It's 2 parking spots for the first 20 units.
And one and a half
for each one after that,
So they're proposing 82 units, or 82 parking spaces.
they're doing 82 parking spaces?
Yes.
So significantly more than the minimum requirement? Okay.
Okay. Would the applicant like to add anything?
No, sir, I don't have anything to add today.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody from the public like to comment on this?
Thank you, Commissioners. John Blanchard, once again. Couple of things on this. First of all, when this project was proposed for Centennial Park, I was extremely outspoken in opposition to it, and so were the Friends of Centennial Park. Not because it was a housing project, but because they wanted to take away about half of Centennial Park to put this in. So I thought it was important for me to come today and to express my support for this project, not only because I think we do need it, I do think it is for our community truly workforce housing, because it is lower, is low-income housing a bad thing to say still, or is that kind of descriptive? Okay, whatever. But anyway, I think that it's an appropriate use on this infill site. This truly is infill. The comprehensive plan calls for it. I think that your designation of urban residential was spot on. And but a couple of things that I would hope that you would look at. I support the rezone, but as you move forward in the site planning of this, to take in consideration a couple of things that Mr. Andrew brought up, and one being that the drainage, the storm drainage for that area is insufficient for what's there. So while everything's being torn up and everything, if you could have development services or engineering or somebody take a serious look at what do you need to upgrade that. I don't know what the sidewalk situation is around there, but a lot of times when you're in an infill situation, for the city to come in and say, hey, let's upgrade the sidewalks and so on. And I do know that Smith Avenue there is in an older neighborhood, very narrow streets, and I was under the understanding that it was no parking on the north side of Smith. So I would just say while you're going through the platting process or looking at different conditions on that I think being in an older neighborhood and smaller homes, a lot of them are probably one-car garage, that they utilize the on-street parking quite a bit. And so hopefully the 82 is adequate for residents and guests, but every time someone comes over and parks on that street, it's taking parking away, very limited parking from those residents. So those are just some things that I hope you will keep in mind as you move forward in this process. But I think it's a great project. I think it's a great infill project and support it 100%. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else from the public like to speak? Any more questions? Okay, I'll bring it back up to commission for action.
I think the right side is due for a motion.
I'll second that. I agree. I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think the parking definitely is nice that it doesn't go to the off-street part of it. So I would make a motion to approve application Z22-3 filed by Salina Rad Homes LP, requesting a change in zoning district classification from MHP to R 2.1? 2.5.
Let's second that. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any more discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed?
I'll do aye. Hold on one
I
second.
just want to confirm the second was Commissioner Hay?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, that passes 5-0. Okay, we're going to move down to 3.4, and I believe Dean's got some
You have,
information on.
you have a written email we received there where the applicants of item 3.4 and 3.5 have requested that consideration of that be postponed to your April 5th meeting. And so we would just request that you make a motion for the record to postpone consideration of items 3.4, application Z19-2, and 3.5, application P22-2A to your April 5th meeting.
What he said, so moved.
Second.
I've got a motion and a second to postpone the two 3.4 and 3.5 to the April 5th meeting.
I don't believe we have anyone in the public that wants to comment on it, but we'll just call that open just so if
Okay.
anyone's interested.
Nobody online, so, okay,
Okay.
looks like, okay.
Very good, thank you.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. That carries 5-0. That moves us down to legislative matters.
We do not have any legislative matters to come before you at this time, and none. We do have two, we usually are dealing with land use and quasi-judicial applications. We do have two legislative matters that will have been filed, will be considered on the April 5th agenda, but none for you this evening. And we don't have any preliminary discussion items for you either.
Okay. I did ask Dean last meeting if he would give us the color future land maps for to be able to keep and hold on to, because I think they come in really handy. So thank you, Dean, for getting those maps for us.
Very nice versus the black and
Yep.
Yeah, especially when they're specially color-coded maps and there's no color, so.
Has anybody got anything else they'd like to add?
I do on one thing, just because of everything that we've done so far on the future development part of it. For both of these that we've gone through, both of them have gone to shilling. I guess at some point in time, from USD 305, and if we look at the other development that's going to go in around Menards, most of that stuff's probably going to go back over to shilling also. USD 305's thoughts on all of these developments and which school these are going to.
Ms. Driscoll.
Planning Commissioners, Lauren Driscoll, Director of Community and Development Services. We have regularly talked to USD 305 as we have been evaluating housing and adding housing to the community. And thus far, particularly for IRBs, RHIDs, we run those through 305 and make sure they're aware of them, talk about where their placement's at. They have not had any concerns thus far. Basically, the superintendent said, we're down in enrollment and we need to be up. And they are prepared to address kind of reevaluating areas where they may need to move kids or district boundaries and things like that. She also relayed, and I think the school district just talked about this, that they have a consultant on board who's going to be looking at districting and growth patterns for them and things like that. And we've shared all the data that we have for housing projections, what Dean's got in the comprehensive plan with those consultants to consider as they look at future site selection for schools and other areas we may have student growth. But at this point, 305 has not told us to put the brakes on any one development based on children going to a particular school.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, before we adjourn, I guess there's no public forum. I guess nobody else has anything else they'd like to add. I'd entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
And a second.
Have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Thank you, guys.